Welcome to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you burn fat, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Okay, I've got Kiran, the world famous microbiome scientist, expert, nerd, Mr. Know-It-All, and he's been just talking nonstop everywhere you go. And I'm excited to talk a little bit of a different subject for you today about BiomeFX and Microbiome Labs, their gut tests. So thanks for making time in your busy schedule.
Of course, yeah, this is my pleasure. This is really exciting because this is where the rubber hits the road, right? It's like, okay, this is the action you take and how you formulate your plan for full recovery. And this getting to a point where, I mean, you've probably made a lot of progress in your own health and life, but then at some point you get to a point where you're like, all right, I'm kind of stuck, and to really figure it out, you really have to do some sort of testing to understand what is going on and get some clues. So yeah, this is really awesome to be able to do this with you on a recording.
So just to explain everyone, the Microbiome Labs, I'll put the links in the show notes, but they have a new lab test called BiomeFX. And if you can explain what the lab test is, and then we'll kind of dive into why I think it's so important to test with functional lab tests as we do as FDN practitioners, instead of guessing and working on our gut health to improve our immune health, to optimize our entire health is really essential.
Yeah. Ultimately, any test is going to be a piece of the puzzle, right? And your health mysteries are absolutely a puzzle because everything is so complex. Our bodies are complex. The things that affect us are complex. Our biology is not linear. It's complex. Everything's multifactorial. And then there's so much history involved in your own personal health. So you really have to piece it together like a health detective. And like any other detective who's trying to solve a crime or a mystery of some sort, the more clues you have, the better off you are in terms of reaching a conclusion. So these types of tests, whether it's the organic acid tests or immune panels, whatever they may be, hormone tests, they all provide a clue. And then working with somebody that knows how to put the clues together is really absolutely critical too. So that's why I love the work we do with practitioners out there, because you really need the help of a trained professional that can put these pieces together for you. Now, the microbiome is arguably the most complex part of everything that goes on in your body. It's far more complex than the human system, the ecosystem in the microbiome, and it controls upwards of 90% of all our function. And so when you've got this highly complex thing that controls the vast majority of your function, and if you don't know what is happening within that microbiome, it's leaving a massive piece of the puzzle out of the investigation for you, right? Now, the problem has been that we've had really terrible ways of measuring the microbiome. Most companies out there that offer stool tests use 16S technology, which is really low resolution, low accuracy. So you really can't understand what is going on within your microbiome in a very effective way. So you might have gotten the test. Some of them may have given you a clue, but you really are not painting an accurate picture of what's happening with your microbiome. And then more importantly, it's the mapping of the microbiome, because the microbiome is a complex ecosystem. And like any other ecosystem, it's not just who's present, it's who else is present. What are the relative abundances of all of these different microbes, and how do they interact with each other? And what are the groups, the functional groups within the microbiome that denote effect, right? So we should be able to measure and look at groups of bacteria that conduct certain functions, and that should relate to the symptoms you're feeling or the issues that you're having, if there's any accuracy to the test at all. So that's what we wanted to change and revolutionize in the whole stool testing world. We wanted to bring a high degree of accuracy to it using whole genome sequencing versus the old 16S testing. And then we wanted to bring real functional analysis so that you can understand more specifically what are the functions and dysfunctions within your microbiome. So We released this early this year, and I think you're a great example of that, because you've been working on your own health for a while. You've got loads of experience with dealing with other people's health, with clients and all that. And so this is a fun case study to walk through using the new BiomeFX tests.
Yeah, and I just went through my Dutch complete test with Dr. Rice from the Dutch Precision and Analytical, and I know you work with them and Dr. Carrie Jones a lot. And
Yeah.
it's just important that, like I created this health optimizer services that you can, just if people don't really have a lot of health complaints, I still think it's essential to improving your health and building on your immunity, that we need to do this type of lab test. And then if you want to dig deeper and collect more clues in your investigation, it's, you don't have to have a lot of complaints, because you kind of find that this is your new normal, or this is a part of aging, and people don't even realize that they could feel so much better than they do now and thrive even more each day, instead of just, I would say, instead of just trying to get through the day and survive, that you could do better if you take ownership for your health and invest in your health.
Absolutely. And remember the whole saying, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think that's accurately what the saying is. And ultimately, we are all kind of cauldrons of disease, right? We've got disease brewing in us. We've got, asymptomatic leaky gut, which is a very prevalent, chronic low-grade inflammation. Those are things you won't feel until they become a significant problem. And some of those things can turn over overnight. It could be, one bad meal that can kind of trigger you and push you over the edge, and then your body starts spiraling because of the baseline of dysfunction that's being set up. So knowing these things ahead of time and monitoring them, and kind of monitoring your function as you go along, it's just a smart thing to do this day and age, when we have so many things around us that harm our inner ecosystem and function. So yeah, like you said, even though you don't feel bad, you don't feel like anything is wrong, the moment you feel something is wrong, you're already now in this phase where you have to cure it. The prevention comes before you feel something, right? So that's the mentality people need to have. Remember, when your body starts to respond in such a way that you feel it, that's when something's already broken and you have to fix it. So you're in fixing mode at that point. Until you feel it, you are in prevention mode. So it's important to note that you really need to keep that preventative mindset if you want to stay ahead.
So true. I mean, when my health issues started to be completely obvious to me back in 2013, 8 years ago, that I wrote in my book, and I keep processing this, that it didn't just happen that day on my bike ride in March 2013. Right. It was years before. I was living probably with dysfunction without knowing it, even though I was thriving and racing super strong and lean and fit. And on the outside, but on the inside, I was completely probably breaking myself down gradually until I hit that rock bottom point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, you're a great example of that, a living proof of that idea and concept, right? So
yeah, that's what my mission is now, to help other people avoid going through that. And you don't know what you don't know unless you do these labs. But so how does this lab, like our microbiome results, we'll go through mine as an example, but how does that correlate with like other tests we'll do? Maybe we can talk about this later, but like the hormone panel, and how they kind of correlate with each other, and you start to see this pattern and how our main health complaints and correlating with the results we'll go through, but also like organic acids test, or if you did a wheat zoomer, leaky gut type of test or something like that, I'm sure we start to see patterns and kind of see the whole picture.
Yeah, and again, thinking about it like a health detective is important, because all of these tests look at different endpoints of your body's function, right? So a microbiome test is really telling you about the ecosystem inside your body. And the way we've designed this test is to tell you about the tendencies and the type of function and dysfunction your body tends to do. Now, then you can see the absolute result of those functions and dysfunctions in tests like your organic acid test or your hormone tests or the Zoomer test. Those tests measure specific endpoints that are the result of the dysfunction, right? This microbiome test tells you that you have a tendency for dysfunction, and then it also gives you an understanding of why you have a tendency to that dysfunction, right? So it's layering on the evidence to help you understand where your issues are. If you do the Dutch test and it's showing you hormone patterns that are clearly dysfunctional, the microbiome test, when you look back at it, may tell you why it's showing up that way. It may give you clues at the root cause of what things you need to adjust in order to improve not only the microbiome, but then your hormone tests as well. So remember, all those things that measure specific endpoints of markers like hormones, like immunoglobulins, and so on, are verifying dysfunction at the metabolic end. What we're doing is showing you kind of the baseline of why you may have those dysfunctions. So going to the root cause. So all the tests are important. You want to do it to put all the pieces together, and each one confirms the other. Now, if there's a contrast in some of them, then that gives you something else to start investigating. If this one test tells you that this is a dysfunction, and this test tells you that this opposite thing is a dysfunction, then either A, it's one of the two is right, or B, both are right, and you've got multiple dysfunctions. It begs more investigation. But and a lot of this is complex, so you need to work with somebody that has familiarity with all of these things.
And I sent you a text that I was watching one of your webinars, and there's plenty of, you've been speaking a lot because the gut biome is essential to our health and immune system. But if people want to dive in deeper, as I've been going down these rabbit holes the last couple of months of researching all this on YouTube, and we can post links in the show notes for some great webinars. So if people want to understand a little bit more deeper on the microbiome, you've done a ton of speaking, and you're like the best speaker. That's why I keep asking you on the show, and everyone asks you, because you explain it at a regular person's level that if we're not scientists, because I keep researching articles and whatnot, and then I have to look at Wikipedia and write down, okay, what does that mean? And I have like 50 pages of notes of, one hour
and that's
seminar.
the problem, right? I mean, research papers are written by scientists for other scientists. And it uses language, and the thing with research papers, which is important to note, is that it uses a lot of assumptions that are not really illustrated or explained well, and in some ways can seem contradictory to one another, because their understanding is, their audience knows all this stuff already, right? And so, and we do that. Like when I write a research paper, I've authored now, co-authored at least, half a dozen or so published research papers in peer-reviewed journals. And when we write those, it's a completely different way of communicating than when you're writing, let's say, like a blog post or something where you're trying to explain things to people. In research papers, they're not designed to explain anything to you, right? They're designed to reveal evidence of studies that the audience who's reading the paper should already be very familiar with. So they can be really hard. It can be really hard if you are going through and trying to learn things about the microbiome and make connections in your own mind to read research papers. And here's the other thing that's really important. This is one of the things that I do professionally, essentially, is what kind of a big part of my job is connecting the dots, right? Every research paper, for the most part, unless it's a big meta-analysis paper, but every research paper is highly focused on one little area, right? And everything about that study, everything about the setup, everything about the background is on that one piece. Now, that one piece, all of it to make sense, you already have to understand these other pieces all around it, right? Because researchers are hyper-focused on one little aspect of a big picture. So if you're reading lots of small pieces, the hyper-focused pieces from all these different research papers, unless you have the capability of connecting all the dots, then the whole thing becomes more and more confusing. So that is a really important part of what I do. I read probably 200 research papers a month, right? And what I do is I connect the dots, and I put the full picture, and I try to give people a 15,000-foot view or 30,000-foot view, depending on where their background information is. And you'll see in this test, it kind of follows that route. We start the test with like a 30,000-foot view of your microbiome and where things are off. And then we go down to a 15,000-foot view, and then we go down to a much more specific view. And then we've got a new version of the test coming out, which you will automatically get the additional data. But we have like double the amount of data on your microbiome and functionality that'll be coming out, and that'll get even deeper into the function of your microbiome.
Well, that's a good transition into looking at the lab results. So if you're listening to this version of the audio podcast, go to YouTube to my channel, Low Carb Athlete. You can watch, what the lab results look like, but let's kind of go through them. It says BiomeFX, functional microbiome analysis. So this is my lab test. I'm exposing myself with my Dutch test and now this, but I think it's just great education for everyone to really take ownership of your health. As this whole COVID-19 pandemic, I just really feel passionate that we should all be taking responsibility for improving our gut health right now and our overall health, and not waiting for some magic pill or shot. And this is what we should be doing now is, okay, am I really healthy inside out? And am I fit and healthy on the outside, but what's underneath your hood? And this is what we have to do, test and not guess. So let's start with the first page of the analysis. You can walk through, see if I can zoom in. There.
Okay. Yeah, let me go through then a quick explanation of this first page. So this is that 30,000-foot view. These are three really important parameters of the characteristics of your microbiome. We've got something called alpha diversity, beta diversity, and then resistome, and I'll explain each of these in a second. So alpha diversity means how diverse is your microbiome based on how many different species are found within the microbiome. And that is a critical part, because when you look at more than a decade's worth of microbiome research, one of the underlying themes across the board is the more alpha diversity you have within your microbiome, meaning how many species you have, the healthier you are overall. The longer you live, actually. So longevity is associated with alpha diversity. Disease resistance is associated with alpha diversity. Metabolic function and so on. All of these things associated with alpha diversity. So if you can scroll up just a tad bit, there's a number right below the alpha diversity, right below it. So the other way.
Oh. The alpha diversity. So this one over there.
So it tells you here, one of the things that we wanted to do is give people an absolute number of the number of species found within the microbiome. As you can see for you, it's 104, right? And this plot right here, we're plotting all of this against a good sized sample of US healthy normal individuals. Where did this data come from? Well, it came from the American Gut Project, the Human Microbiome Project, and so on. So they've been sequencing healthy American guts. And what does that mean to be healthy American? Well, they've been sequencing guts of people that don't have any chronic illness, who have not been managed for any disease conditions, who aren't taking any medication or anything, and with a big age variant. And this is mixed male and female. So this is the data that it's being measured against. So it maps where you stand to the average healthy American. And that's important, because you can't do it to an average healthy North African or European, because they live in different regions and their microbiomes will look different. So here's the interesting thing about the alpha diversity. This is called a whisker plot, right? So whisker plot is like a bell curve, if you will. The very ends of the plots are the ultimate ends of the bell curves. The bottom of it is going to be like the 5th percentile. The top of it, which is in the one closer to 180, is like the 99th percentile. The big block in the middle, the big gray block, which is around 120, that's the average of where people are, right? So the average American, the average healthy American, has about 115 to 120 species in their microbiome. Now, here's the crazy thing about that. That in itself is pretty low. So the average healthy American's microbiome is pretty low in terms of diversity. When you look at diversity of people in North Africa or other parts of the world where they eat a real varied diet and so on, and they tend to have very healthy microbiomes, their diversity is in the 300-400 species level. So this, to me, in general, means Americans in general need to up our diversity.
Mhm.
And certainly for you, Debbie, that's one of the things you really need to work on. 104, even though you're kind of at the bottom average of Americans, is pretty low. You want to get your species diversity up as high as you can, and you may not be able to exceed, let's say, 150, but you should be able to keep getting it up there. So all of the recommendations that are shown in this part of the report will give you ideas on how to increase your alpha diversity, right? So a lot of it is about diet. It's about increasing the diversity of the diet. A lot of the diversity that you need to increase from the diet is on the plant-based side of the diet, because a lot of the microbes that live in the gut are very dependent on plant-based nutrients, things like polyphenols and certain types of carbohydrates, resistant starches, soluble and insoluble fibers, and so on. So those types of microbes are clearly not getting enough food, enough supply, and the diversity is remaining low. So I would call this pretty low diversity, and it becomes paramount at the end of the day that is the first thing to work on, is focus on increasing diversity. Fasting can increase diversity as well. Now, the second thing, the beta diversity, is how different is your microbiome in terms of the types of species found from those healthy microbiomes that are found in the US population, right? And that's important because microbiomes tend to get adapted to the ecosystem that you're in. So if you are having lots of gut issues and your microbiome doesn't map in clusters to where the average American's microbiome maps, then it means that you've got bacteria that are really ill-adapted to this ecosystem. So you see all of those plots on the beta diversity plot. That's where the clustering of the American microbiomes tend to be in terms of the types of species that exist. Now yours plots right in the middle of that, so you're perfectly fine. It means that you don't have some sort of crazy dysbiosis where you have organisms in your microbiome that are unusual for our ecosystem that are driving dysfunction. So you're good there. You don't have to worry about that. What you do have to start thinking about is, how do I really increase alpha diversity? Now, the low alpha diversity also then supports this next part, the resistome occurrence. Now, what is the resistome? The resistome basically gives you how stable your microbiome population is. And one of the ways that they measure that is by measuring the resistance forces between all of the microbes within your microbiome. So any ecosystem that is a stable ecosystem has a high degree of competition, right? The more competition the ecosystem has, the more stable it is. What that means is that you have a good distribution of bacteria, and they're all competing with one another, which brings about stability, because if you don't have enough competition, then you have a tenuous microbiome where something can throw it off, where it throws off the balance enough where few species can then take over and overgrow, right? So you lose that stability within the microbiome. That's the whole idea with economic markets, for example, where they always say competition in the market is really good. It brings stability to the market. When you have monopolies, when you have companies that have too much, and there is no economic forces in competition, then you go into a tenuous situation where a few handful of companies can take over the market and control things in a very negative way, right? So that's the same thing with the microbiome. So this resistome is really important to note. Your resistome is pretty low, which means that your microbiome in general is pretty tenuous, which means that, let's say you had to take a course of antibiotics or something, it could throw off your complete, the ecosystem. You travel and you pick up a bug overseas, and you get sick for a few days, that can throw off your whole microbiome. So you do need to increase the resistome, and that is driven in large part by the lack of diversity. in the microbiome. The more diversity you have in the microbiome, the higher your resistome is going to be, and the more stable the ecosystem is going to be. So this is the 30,000-foot view. And the reason why we present this first is this gives you kind of the big picture things of what you need to work on right off the bat. Right. So in your case, it's the alpha diversity and the resistome, and the alpha diversity in itself will start to fix the resistome. So this gives you that 30,000-foot view, and it will start to explain why some of the things are off. Now, if we go down to the pathobiome, that's another really important part. So that's another part that fits into this 30,000-foot view, and your pathobiome is pretty good. So what does that mean? Pathobiome looks at all of the pathogens that are found in your microbiome. Now, it's completely normal for you to have pathogens in your microbiome. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, many of the pathogens have beneficial effect. The question is, what is their relative abundance to every other bacteria in the microbiome? If their relative abundance tends to be higher than it should be, meaning the proportion of pathogens in your microbiome is higher than the non-pathogenic commensals, then you will start to have a problem where the pathogens are likely driving issues within your microbiome and then the symptomatic issues that you feel as well. Now, this is important because if you've done other tests in the past, they may find some pathogens, and they'll give you an arbitrary high or low for that pathogen, not a relative abundance. They'll give you the arbitrary high or low, which can be very problematic because the presence of the pathogen doesn't mean anything is wrong. It's what is the relative abundance of that pathogen to everything else, right? So that's the important distinction here. And when you have a high pathobiome index, when you're going up over 7, 8, 9, that means the pathogens are not really a problem for you. Now, in your case, they did point out one, Clostridium difficile. It's not really in a completely out of range area, but I don't know, have you had C. diff issues in the past?
Not that I know of, just Blasto hominis and then H. pylori was.
Okay, which means you've taken antibiotics for those?
I did a herbal protocol for those.
Okay, you've taken antibiotics in the past though?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So if you've had rounds of antibiotics in the past, it gives the opportunity for C. diff to overgrow. And then herbals too. I mean, herbal antimicrobials are antimicrobials. Anything that starts to kill off bacteria in large quantities in the gut will start to favor the growth of Clostridium difficile. Now, at this level, it's not causing you C. diff type of issues, but it's just indicative that, all right, it's there, it's present, and its amount is maybe a little higher than you should have it. Now, C. diff gets controlled well when your alpha diversity increases, because the other microbes within your microbiome will start bringing down its relative numbers, right? So again, this is not something a problem. This is not something you need to go and take an antibiotic for, but it's just indicating that, hey, this one is something you should think about and look at. It's still within the relative abundance range, but it's just something you have to look at. Now, then if you scroll up,
well, I just want to point out that it's interesting. On here, it says, avoid antibacterial household cleaners. And down here, it says that too. Avoid antibiotics, of course, but, wash your hands and not use the antibacterial all the time. And that's what I think is be interesting after this, COVID starts to slow down. Everyone's been over antibacterial everything, and see what their gut biome looks after taking off all the bacteria.
That's an issue. I've had a lot of people reporting to me that all of a sudden they've got lots more bloating and this and that just from being home and being over sterile. And that's going to be an issue. So then these are the other pathogens that were measured. And we don't list their numbers unless their numbers are out of range, right? So this is everything else to check. So basically your pathogens are not really an issue for you. This one pathogen that may be kind of in the higher normal will be controlled when your diversity increases. So you don't, exactly. So you don't have to worry about the pathogens. Now, to me, this part is probably the more telling part. So this is now the 15,000-foot view, right? The 30,000-foot view is like the big picture of the map of your microbiome. Now we've gone down to the phylum level. Phylum level is like the biggest groupings of bacteria. And there's some good data to show that certain phylum ratios have certain tendencies in terms of the way your body responds to things like foods. So in your case, this ratio of Firmicutes to Bacteroides is way high, which means that you have higher levels of Firmicutes than you do Bacteroides. And that in itself can explain lots of metabolic issues. So if you have issues where you find it harder to keep to burn off fat or keep weight off, and as you get older, you tend to have a tendency to increase weight easier. That all can be explained by this ratio in itself, right? That's exactly what happens when you have a higher level of Firmicutes. This is pretty standard for the North American population, that they tend to have higher levels of Firmicutes and Bacteroides. And this is driven in part by high diets that are high in protein and high in animal products. And the thing is, when you're trying to get fit and you're trying to get lean, we have this understanding that, I'm trying to lean down, so I'm just going to do more protein. Right? And I'm going to do more exercise and more protein, more exercise and more protein. And you find this point where you kind of plateau and you're stuck and you're not really getting to where you need to get. That's because your body doesn't respond to food the way you think it does, because the microbiome plays such a big role in what happens to the food in your system. What this indicates is you got to get your Bacteroides up to improve your metabolic profile. And that higher level of Bacteroides also improves some of the inflammatory profile, and also improves the metabolic profile in terms of hormone response to the presence of food. So the leptin response and adiponectin response, those are all controlled by Bacteroides type of bacteria. So does this hit home at all for you, for what you've struggled with?
Yeah, what's funny is, I told you before, I struggle with my running, and I used to be a strong, fast runner, and that's always my indicator. What's going on? Am I getting better? And, putting weight on is weird. Plus, we're at home more, but it feels like it has nothing to do with my exercise and nutrition that I'm gaining weight and losing muscle. So it seems, it makes a little bit sense of my poor diversity and extra bacteria and not enough of the other stuff, but I'll add on and we can continue. I started trying to add more protein in my diet the last year or so, and I've done low carb for like 10 years because all my genetic tests say I do better with more protein and carb sensitive, and, doing the metabolic typing, your blood type O. And so it's, so N=1, and all these people trying to do carnivore and, not do greens. And you hear, yes, you do need keto greens, and then you do need more carbs. And it's just, so again, this is individualized approach to say, okay, your body needs a little bit more diversity. You need a little more greens, and, you have nutrition recommendations there. But I think it's a good indicator of, are you doing the right food program for your microbiome?
Yeah, and so that's the problem, right? So when you think about, like you mentioned, when you do the genetic typing, the problem with the genetic typing is just looking at your genes, but your genes make up less than 10% of all your metabolic function, right? 90% of your metabolic function is dictated by the microbes in your gut. So if you're designing your diet based on your genetic tendencies, more likely it'll be off. So this Bacteroides Firmicutes ratio that you have, where Firmicutes is higher, way higher than it should be, is a result of years of low carb dieting and high protein intake. And the problem with this is the higher Firmicutes ratio is shown to be associated with all kinds of metabolic dysfunction down the road. When you're younger and you're more lean and you're fitter, your body can handle this disproportion. But then as you get older and everything starts to slow down, become more toxic and bogged down, this ratio becomes more and more of an issue. And not only does this ratio have an impact, obviously, on your appearance metabolically, what you look like, but it also has a huge impact on, all kinds of immune function and other health associated things, within the body itself. So Bacteroides are the types of microbes that produce lots of short chain fatty acids and, anti-inflammatory compounds and impact hormone response and so on. So you want to get the Bacteroides up, which means that I would start adding lots more of these kind of foods that are shown in the nutrition section and reduce the protein intake. So just that, again, this is the 15,000-foot view.
Yeah.
So now it starts to give you something more simple. Now, Bacteroides is a huge phylum of bacteria where there are lots of really important microbes in it. And because your Bacteroides is lower than it should be, that may be where there's a big group of bacteria that really are not showing up on your diversity score either, right?
Mm.
So this just improving the Bacteroides level may bring up your diversity quite a bit.
Good. So I know we're going to run out of time because there's like so much information each page. So anything I should stop at, just let me know which ones we want to go over.
Yeah, so let's look at the Prevotella. We'll look at just these two things. The next page of yours is you're pretty much normal in most of those, and I'll make a couple comments. But let's talk about this a little bit. So this Proteobacter to Actinobacter ratio. So increasing Actinobacter, we talk about again consuming plant-derived foods. You know, in general, you're a little bit off here as well. You tend to have higher levels of proteobacteria, but you're in general you're doing well here. Now, Actinobacter and Proteobacter make up a much smaller proportion of your total microbiome. Combined, they make up about 5%, 4.5% to 5%. The Firmicutes Bacteroides part make up almost 90% of your microbiome. So clearly, those are the most influential bacteria within your microbiome. So because you are basically in line here with nothing that looks severely problematic, you don't need to really pay attention too much on this. As you start making changes to your Bacteroides Firmicutes ratio, that's when you'll start to see the impact. But one thing here on the next part, this with the Prevotella side, that's really interesting, and we've now run several hundred microbiome tests in U.S. population, and we're seeing this lack of detection of Prevotella as being much more common than we thought. And it's disturbing in many ways, right? Because it doesn't necessarily mean it's not there, but it's not there at a level that's detectable even by the most sensitive of technologies. And remember, Prevotella is a whole group of bacteria. It's not just one microbe that we're looking for. So this really speaks to a lot of issues of chronic inflammation when you have too high of Prevotella or too low of Prevotella. There is a dysfunction here. And as you see, so it says low Prevotella Bacteroides ratios, meaning really low levels of Prevotella compared to Bacteroides. And remember, this Bacteroides is different than the Bacteroidetes, which is in the first one. This is a different grouping of bacteria, are associated with metabolic imbalances and positively correlated with a high intake of protein and animal fat. So in the Western diet, when we start to go towards higher intakes of protein, higher intakes of saturated fat from animal products, we start to kill off our our Prevotella ratio. And as Prevotella levels go down, it actually increases the disruption and imbalance in our metabolic profile. So again, this is a secondary part of where that metabolic imbalance can occur. And the problem is these types of metabolic imbalances occur and become more and more prevalent as you get older, right? So as your mitochondria become more dysfunctional, as each cell doesn't produce as much energy, as your metabolic rate starts to go down, the impact of these kind of ratios becomes more and more prevalent. So again, this is just another view that shows that low carb, high protein dieting causes dysbiosis over time, and this dysbiosis is meaningful. This has long-term health implications. At the time when you are much younger, it'll help you become much leaner, but the problem is over time it causes dysbiosis. So that's the messaging there, and you really wouldn't know it until you looked at a test like this.
Yeah.
So we can go on to the next page.
So just real quick. So what if we talk about balancing our blood sugar and teaching the body to burn fat. How is this related? Because if I have an apple or banana by itself, I get a headache in like 5 seconds. So is this something to do with the microbiome, or, are you still looking at, intermittent fasting, But when we eat, we should have a balanced macronutrient ratio to balance our blood sugar, teach the body to burn fat, and feed the microbiome these good foods to create diversity of the keystone strains.
Exactly. So think about this. Is one of the things I mentioned is that when you look at these two phylum levels, right? So sorry, go back up to the page we're on.
Yeah.
So Prevotella, Bacteroides, Proteobacter, Actinobacter are much smaller groups of bacteria than the very first one we looked at, which is the Firmicutes Bacteroidetes ratio, right? Firmicutes Bacteroidetes make up almost 90% of your total microbiome. So when you're trying to start to adjust your diet to improve these ratios, the focus on the adjustment should be on the biggest groups of microbes, which is the Firmicutes Bacteroides. So if you go back to the top of this page where it talks about the Firmicutes Bacteroides ratio, right there. So because the ratio is off, it shows that when you need to increase your Bacteroides so that your Bacteroides becomes higher than your Firmicutes, you want to consume these kinds of things. So you want more things like green bananas, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, and so on. So when you start adjusting your particular diet to improve the ratios, this becomes the bigger focus of what you should be doing. And then you should be adding a few things that improve the Prevotella ratio as well. So think about 90% of your focus is to improve the Bacteroides Firmicutes ratio, and then 5 to 6% of your focus is what do I need to do to add to improve my Prevotella. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because of the number of microbes within each of these groups. So what you'd want to do is, as you're adding in more broccoli and more of the greens that we're talking about, you also can add in a few fruits throughout the day to improve the Prevotella.
Got it.
And here's the thing, that when we're talking about trying to train our body to burn fat, Bacteroidetes, that big ratio, the Firmicutes Bacteroidetes ratio, the bacteria that fall within Bacteroidetes are the main fat-burning bacteria. They're the ones that upregulate short-chain fatty acid production, butyrate production. They're the ones that turn on AMPK, which is one of the signals for every cell in your body to burn fat. So they are the fat-burning bacteria. And so what you tend to see is that when you're younger and you're eating a high protein diet and low carb, because your metabolic rate, because your mitochondria, your energy demand and all is high, you can stay lean despite that diet messing up your microbiome, where it actually reduces your fat burning capability. But then as your metabolic rate slows down and your mitochondria will get more dysfunctional when you get older, then you start to see the impact of this change more dramatically. So in fact, the high protein, low carb diet over time creates less fat burning impetus in the body.
So fascinating. Okay,
crazy, right?
So
yeah.
Anything
so then
on
this area gets a little bit more specific. So if you have metabolic dysfunctions, things that certain foods really just don't deal well with you, this kind of gives you an overview of what they may be. For you, ammonia producing and ammonia clearing bacteria is interesting. Something to think about, because ammonia producing bacteria is low, which is great, which means that you have lower levels of bacteria that will convert the protein that you're digesting into ammonia, right? And if you get bacteria that produce a lot of ammonia, it causes all kinds of issues within your system. It causes an increase in the pH of your gut. It makes you more susceptible to pathogen colonization and so on, which you're not really seeing. But you also have very low levels of ammonia clearing bacteria, which is also problematic, because should you continue to eat a much higher protein diet, what may happen is you may actually get an increase in ammonia producing bacteria, which means that your body starts producing more ammonia, but you have very low or no detectable ammonia clearing bacteria. So your microbiome cannot clear the ammonia from your system. So all of that ammonia goes to your liver. And then over time, your liver becomes more and more and more toxic. That's a big driver of things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or liver dysfunction, right? So as you age, as you become older, you want to keep an eye on these ammonia clearing and producing bacteria. And the more you feed it protein, the more ammonia is going to be produced, and you don't have the capability of clearing that ammonia effectively. So you want to be careful there as well.
That's what I was, making notes for my article, is about the liver function and how the detoxification system needs to be functioning at a high level, and to get rid of all this the bad stuff in their cell autophagy.
Exactly. Yeah. Your estrobolome is good. That's the constellation of bacteria that help with hormone balance, with estrogen balance. Seems to be right in line on average with where average Americans are. Sulfate reducing is interesting. You're great because you don't have a lot of sulfate reducing bacteria, which is good because there are lots of healthy foods that are high in sulfates. And if you have high levels of sulfate reducing bacteria, then these very healthy foods like seafood, eggs, Parmesan cheese, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and so on, they will become converted into hydrogen sulfide in the gut. And that hydrogen sulfide is actually very inflammatory for the large bowel. And actually is associated with things like inflammatory bowel disease. So if you are high in sulfate reducing bacteria, then you'd have to be very careful about the types of foods that you eat so you don't produce too much hydrogen sulfide. But you're good. You have very little low levels of sulfate reducing. Same with methanogens. You don't have a problem with producing too much methane. So you can tolerate lots of these foods quite a bit. And you probably don't produce a lot of methane gas either. Now, in the next version of the test, which will be coming out in a month or so, and you'll get, anyone that does the first version of the test will get the updated report with all the new data. That'll go into a lot more of those types of functionalities, which we can revisit when we do that, when it comes back in June. Now, this next part goes down to keystone strains. People don't talk and put enough focus on keystone strains. These types of keystone strains dictate everything about your microbiome. And in fact, they control lots of aspects of diversity of the microbiome and metabolic function as well. One of the ones that to me was troubling for you is the non-detected Akkermansia.
Mm-hmm.
Akkermansia is such an important keystone bacteria for metabolic health. It is inversely correlated with everything under cardiometabolic syndrome, which includes things like dementia, polycystic ovarian syndrome, Alzheimer's, heart disease, diabetes, and so on. It protects against all of those. Akkermansia, it feeds off of short-chain fatty acids, oligosaccharides, all these things that come from fruits and vegetables. So years of high-protein, low-carb intake and then eliminating things like fruits because we're concerned about the sugar in fruits will bring down Akkermansia levels quite dramatically. Akkermansia is also one of the key bacteria in regenerating your mucosal layer. And if you have no functioning Akkermansia, then the regeneration of the mucosal layer gets heavily compromised. So the things that come into your system that can damage your mucosal barrier, make your gut leaky, aren't getting repaired effectively. That becomes really problematic over time. So you definitely need to focus on getting your Akkermansia up. Akkermansia can be upwards of 5% of your total microbiome in a healthy individual. Now, your fecalum bacteria levels are good, which is great. Fecalum bacteria is a good short-chain fatty acid producer, and it helps against inflammatory bowel conditions and so on. So that's really good that you have high levels of fecalum bacteria. You have high levels of Rhamnococcus bromai, which is good. So you can deal well with plant-based foods. You can utilize cellulose and all of the benefits you get from cellulose and the polyphenols. Rhamnococcus bromai also is associated with having good skin and lower levels of skin problems. I don't think, have you ever had acne or dealt with skin issues?
No, not really ever.
Okay, so that's a good sign. Good. People with really low levels of Rhamnococcus bromai will tend to have inflammatory skin issues as well. Rhamnococcus flavorifaciens is another very important microbe. It's a cellulose degrader. I'm not as concerned about this because you do have other Rhamnococcus bacteria, and you may just not have gotten an appropriate inoculum of it, but I would still look at things that may improve it. But again, all of the recommendations to improve Rhamnococcus flavorifaciens are also similar things to improve the bigger view, the Bacteroides, and also the things that improve your diversity. So I think you'll see some of these microbes coming up as you start improving your diversity.
So just a note that I do eat my vegetables I do have are typically Brussels sprouts, broccoli, and cauliflower. And then I've been doing lots of onion and garlic lately. But is there any correlation with a damaged mucosal barrier and leaky gut that even if I'm eating these foods, I'm not digesting and breaking them down with digestive enzymes and my mucosal barrier is damaged, so I'm not able to absorb the nutrients? Is that going to be impacted here if I'm already eating a lot of those?
To some degree, yes, they will be, and the other part of it is, how swiftly are they moving into your large intestine? What is the fermentation kind of kinetics of your large intestine? And the kinetics go down when your diversity is low, right? So think about it this way: in the microbiome, you've got different layers of bacteria. You've got ones that I call the primary digester. They're the ones that'll take the Brussels sprout that's coming in, or the components of the Brussels sprout that your body can't digest and absorb, and they'll start breaking it down and digesting it. And during that process, they will produce secondary metabolites that then feed other bacteria. So it's not that the Brussels sprout itself is feeding all of the microbes, it's that there is a primary digester breaking down the Brussels sprouts, making it more, giving it more utility, and then the secondary metabolites of that are feeding other groups of bacteria. Then those bacteria metabolize the secondary metabolites and produce tertiary metabolites that then feed other groups of bacteria. So even though you're eating Brussels sprouts, if you don't have adequate primary digesting of it by the first group of bacteria, you're not necessarily going to be feeding the next set of bacteria either. So utilization of those carbohydrates, of those sources of starches, fibers, and so on, is based on how diverse your microbiome is, right? So that's why that 30,000-foot view becomes really important right off the bat, is working on that diversity improves the utilization, because the foods that you consume don't get directly metabolized by all of the bacteria. Many of the bacteria count on primary digesters to give them secondary metabolites. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
and so part of that is, that's why we design things like the mega prebiotic, right?
Yeah.
Because these are highly focused oligosaccharides that are already isolated and to some degree pre-digested, and then those will help feed the secondary and tertiary digesters already. So as you start to try to improve your diversity and the keystone strains with foods, you should also add in things like the oligosaccharides, the concentrated oligosaccharides. You may also look at pre-digested carbohydrates like fermented foods, right? Because then there's some pre-digestion already going on during the fermentation process. So instead of just regular sprouts, you would eat a fermented sprout, and that would give you different carbohydrate profile to provide to the larger mass of bacteria that are trying to find the nutrients to do well.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's what I was going to ask is, is it better to do liquid version like athletic greens and have it, with the megaspore or the prebiotic and the mucosal drink mix I've been mixing together. So
absolutely. I would be using all of those kind of things. You want to provide varying forms of the nutrients so that you feed slightly different groups of bacteria throughout the day.
Yeah. So I know you probably have I
do in 1 minute, actually, but let me just make another quick mention of these two things. And this is, again, the non-detectable bifidobacterium longum. Bifidobacterium longum is another very important metabolic health type of microbe. And that metabolic health type of microbe is essential in its processing of acetate into butyrate and other short-chain fatty acids. So again, these things all will start to come up as you start improving the diversity within your microbiome. This gives you a deeper view, this part of the test. But again, when you are thinking about how am I going to go about making the changes to see changes in all of this stuff, start with the changes that talk about the 30,000-foot view, then go to the changes that talk about the 15,000-foot view, and then work your way into the more specifics here. Because oftentimes when you make the bigger changes, a lot of these numbers start to change as well already, right? Because the lack of lactobacillus, the lack of bifidobacteria in your gut is already part of the dysfunction of low diversity. When you start working on your higher diversity, you will start to see some of these species come back automatically.
Well, thank you so much. I know you've got a full day because you're so popular around the world.
Everybody wants to talk to a nerd these days.
Everyone does. So thanks so much. And we'll put all the links in the show notes so people can learn more how to order their lab test and look at the supplements. I just got my box. I pretty much ordered every microbiome lab product yesterday.
Awesome. And we should redo the tests again in, let's say, 3 months.
Yeah.
And see how things change once you add in things like the prebiotic, and maybe you'll start doing more fermented foods and so on to try to improve the diversity.
Yep. I'm on a mission. Thanks to you. All
right. Thank you so much.
To your next call. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at debbiepotts.net. You can help us to continue to grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.